Walczak.
I'm here.
Lena?
Alderman Bushy.
Here.
Alderman Meyer.
Here.
Alderman Hampshire.
Here.
Alderman Garrow. Alderwoman Schneider.
Here.
Alderman Nervin.
Here.
Mayor Word.
Here. Just a very short comment here at the beginning. Last week went pretty well. I'm hoping we're going to try to follow the same format tonight, and that's for each of the two topics, staff will make a presentation, and then tonight's an opportunity to ask questions rather than to express opinion or to suggest what we like or don't like. That'll be at the appropriations meeting as opposed to these workshops. So this is for us to gather information, try to hear the overview from all departments rather than what we've had in the past, which is more talk among us and less information from staff. And the idea is that we before we start deliberating, we ought to hear from everybody. I hope we can kind of stick to that. It'll also allow us to get through and out of here at a reasonable time this evening. So without further ado, Director Lundin. No? Oh, excuse me, Mr. Administrator.
Thank you, Mayor. Members of the council, just wanted to cover a couple of quick housekeeping items before we jump into tonight's workshop presentation. As the mayor mentioned, we'll be reviewing the Public Works Department, the Community Development Department, and the Parks Division this evening as part of our progression. Last Friday, draft budgets were distributed to each member of the Common Council. Those are the documents that we are hoping staff is hoping that you'll bring to the Appropriations Committee meeting, which has been confirmed for next Thursday, October 3rd, here in City Hall starting at 6 p.m. So next Thursday night, the Appropriations Committee will be meeting to consider the proposed budget. Within the draft budget document that went out on Friday, you have detailed expenditure budgets across 23 areas within the various departments, and it also includes accomplishments and objectives for each budget area as well as performance measures for each department. Slides from tonight's meeting as well as last week's workshop meetings will be distributed to all members of the council starting tomorrow. So I will be emailing out copies of all the PowerPoint slides for everything that you've seen here over the last two nights so that you have that information as you go through the draft budget in advance of next week's meeting. And then staff will, in my office, will also be following up with a memorandum either late this week or early next week that's going to detail all of the budget requests that have been outlined over these two nights during the workshop meetings so that you have a handy-dandy scorecard, for lack of a better term, to follow through when we get into appropriations next week. Included in that memorandum will be any updates from the finance department regarding those outstanding revenue numbers that we're still waiting on that may have an impact on the final budget number that ultimately gets considered next week. And then coming out of next Thursday night's Appropriations Committee meeting, over the last couple of years, we've been able to get a recommendation in favor of approving the budget in one meeting. But in the event that we need a second night for appropriations, it would be my suggestion that we schedule that second meeting, if necessary, after the rescheduled council meeting on October 15th. As you know, we're canceling our October 8th Common Council meeting due to the Jewish holidays and the lack of a quorum that we will be unable to attain that evening. And so that meeting has been rescheduled for October 15th. That's really the last week that we would be able to get a vote recommending approval of the budget before we have to publicly publish notice of the proposed budget on October 22nd. So those are some dates. I'll encapsulate all of that in the email that goes out tomorrow with the PowerPoint slides, but I just wanted to give you a heads up in terms of the near-term progression that we'll be following over the next week to 10 days.
Now, Director Lundin.
Can I ask one question about that real quick? With the information being provided to us, is there going to be something to the fact of that we have the presentations tonight, we have the budget in front of us, what that difference is, and I'm talking about dollar-wise, but what does that mean for services. So what services get cut because of that, or what services, because if there's a budget difference between $30,000, what they're requesting, that something has to be cut out of what's being requested. Is there some information that we'll be able to get to see what that is?
I'm not quite sure I'm grasping the intent of your question, Alderman Meyer.
Well,
The proposed cut?
The intent is we have a presentation tonight
Sure.
of that, and then we have kind of like a preliminary one we had beforehand for the budget. We have the budget here, there's a dollar difference in between those,
Yes.
what's being proposed in that. So, give us kind of a rough idea of the differences inside of that and what that curtails, and I'm not talking dollar-wise, I'm talking about, is it just gonna be reduced hours someplace, or is it gonna be that this project will be cut, or we'll have to delay something in order to hit that budget goal?
Can I ask a question? I mean, you know the questions. Are you talking about in that binder?
Correct, from the original preliminary to this.
So the adjustments between the original binder and the new binder, what is the difference? And-
What type of, is that gonna be a service cut, is that gonna be an hour cut, is that gonna be just cost savings? Is that just gonna be something to get to that dollar figure? So instead of us having to go through and try to figure out where $30,000 is lacking on some project or something, kind of give us an idea what that is?
If I could jump in.
Yeah.
The binder that went out late last week presents a balanced budget. At this point in time, we balanced it with a levy increase.
No, I understand that you're still not following. I'm saying is that if there's a difference in between that to this,
Is there a difference?
is there a
between the
difference in between it?
original-
And if there's a difference in between it, per department, what is that meaning to us on a level of, a service level, an hour cut level, a cost savings level, to get to that budget difference by the department? Not just saying, okay, we're cutting the department 5%. What are we
Was
doing
there a
to-
difference between the first binder and the second binder?
Yes, the first budget had a lot more assumptions or estimates. The budget, the final draft, final proposed budget is balanced. The numbers that we were able to refine, we did. We still had a budget imbalance, and so we plugged that gap with
And were there changes in services, or were it simply that you were able to refine numbers?
We were just able to refine numbers. We didn't, it's a maintenance of effort budget, as that was our takeaway, that was our task. So the budget in the final version is pretty much a maintenance of effort budget balanced with a levy increase.
How much of a levy increase? As long as you're saying that.
Approximately 197,000.
So there's no difference in services between binder one and binder two. The differences were that they simply could narrow down the numbers based on getting more accurate estimates.
In simpler terms, yeah, but what I was saying, what I was originally trying to say was that city staff comes before us and requests something, okay? And then we can't fulfill all those, we got this inside of, we got a budget that's to us. So what are we not doing for the departments to get to this budget?
Okay, so all of these memos we've gotten, which all have suggestions, are any of them incorporated in that budget?
No.
So all of the things in front of us.
Okay,
Does that answer your question?
not 100%, but we'll.
Trying to get there because I'm trying to
We'll
understand.
proceed.
It's a little bit of a circus. Pretty straightforward, actually, I think.
Okay.
Kristen, we'll try to get you more information, Dale.
I will try to be straightforward here in my presentation. I welcome you to the conversation of public works this evening. I appreciate your patience as we all go through this and have the opportunity to present the perspective of our departments. For those that are not aware, as the Director of Public Works and City Engineer, I oversee both of the utilities as well as the Public Works Department, which for budgeting purposes otherwise includes buildings, engineering, fleet, highway, parks, pool, and recycling, or what's more commonly known as the brush slate. We employ over 32 full-time employees and over 36 seasonal or part-time employees across all of the divisions. We have the 7 different divisions, at least as far as budgeting purchases are concerned, and we perform a number of key services, and the number of words here was an intentional to just say that we do a lot. And that includes overseeing 9 city facilities, over 210 miles of roadway, 340 pieces of equipment, 1,500 brush permits, and over 12 miles of bike trails. From a budget perspective, obviously we have both fixed costs and variable costs. The fixed costs, which are mostly contributed to personnel costs, are about 68% of our budget, and that's been relatively consistent over the years. We also have an amount of variable costs, both for contracted services and the purchase materials that we otherwise address that make up the other 32% of our budget. We have revenue from a number of sources, brush permits, the pool, park rentals. The fees for engineering are the time that we bill through for development reviews to the developers, and then fees for highway that include, among other things, culvert permits that we otherwise install for individual residences. Over the past 5 years, we've seen a decline in our overall budget, some attributed to personnel changes relative to staff improvements, and others due to reduction in the O&M budgets. With respect to the individual divisions, for buildings, we have gone down from 2016 to projected for 2020, the number of city facilities. You may recall that includes the elimination of the Logaman Center, the Green Bay Shop that formerly served the water utility, and then both the facilities on Mequon Road that are now wonderful restaurants that I'm sure everyone is otherwise enjoying. There was a reduction in building staff that then is otherwise supplemented with some contracted cleaning services. And we have seen a decline in the number of work orders, mostly attributed to the reduction in number of buildings, but also with a reduction in staff. Engineering, I won't go through all of these, but again, to show that we perform a number of services specifically for both development review and permit issuance, in addition to drainage work, both for the Drainage Capital Improvement Program and for our roadside drainage associated with our road program. I guess the other thing I'll highlight selfishly here is the biggest difference for me personally between 2016 and 2020 is my loss in years of experience. We had a number of long tenured employees in our department retire, and with them, of course, went a wealth of knowledge. So we have a great staff in place, but are otherwise rebuilding that historic knowledge and process as we move forward. For fleet, just for comparison, I provided the fuel prices and the overall budget that we've seen over the past 5 years. For highway, we've been relatively stable as it relates to a number of items. Snow events are always interesting to view over time, but really, relatively speaking, remain relatively stable. We've seen certainly an increase in tree removals, mostly attributed to emerald ash borer efforts. Christmas tree chipping has gone up, but I think that was otherwise good for the economy as well, so we just pick up after the holidays. Parks has been relatively stable with respect to the number of facilities that we otherwise maintain, at least over the past 5 years. I think the biggest impact for us has been the reduction in the O&M budget, as we're have new staff with renewed energy and new ideas who are otherwise looking for funding support to be able to implement some of those initiatives. That would be something we're looking for in terms of support. Pool attendance is down. This is a trend somewhat across communities, but also is partially anyway as a result of the success of the Super Pass, whereby, for those that don't know, Mequon pass holders can add on a super pass that allows them to access the Cedarburg, Grafton, and Port Washington pools. The brush site, we've seen a reduction in the number of permits, but an increase in the budget, mostly due to actually the wood from our own city operations that otherwise go into the recycling center. The good news is, for those that may have seen the publication of the free logwood that we were otherwise trying to provide, that would potentially reduce the chipping costs that we have at the end of the season. Fingers crossed we have someone interested in coming and taking all of the wood. So that will certainly save us money in the end on that cost. We do a lot, both annually and certainly over the last 5 years. We've been able to complete over 30 projects off the drainage CIP without an impact to the drainage CIP budget. We've done that with internal O&M budgets or our own labor. We revamped how we purchase our paint for road striping, that for the first year, certainly since I've been here, that allowed us to restripe all of the roads in the city rather than half at a time, as was past practice. Similarly, we purchased what's called a shoulder reclaimer that changed our reshouldering methods, that saved us not only on material costs, but on the speed of service with which we're otherwise able to address shouldering. This year was the first year in over 4 years that we were able to implement some capital facility projects. We had the support of LRIP funding for the reconstruction of Cedarburg Road, which is now open. We've certainly had a lot of attention turned towards EAB abatement, and that has affected staff at nearly every single level, from the road program planning to field staff, certainly for the removal itself. And in comparison, we've had a 325% increase in tree removal over former tree operations. It requires a large amount of coordination, a large amount of communication, and certainly a large amount of effort and time. I've had a complete turnover in my division head staff, which is the superintendent level of staff, which has led, again, to some renewed energy and excitement, and certainly the identification of some new opportunities and other ways for operations and things to be addressed. Currently, we're certainly will be focused from now until the end of EAB with the abatement process. We're excited about some potential changes in our GIS system that would allow us to get information out to the public more and better. We are, as the Public Works Committee otherwise knows, looking to finalize the Hawthorne Road technical report so that we can have some future discussions as to what the state of that road will otherwise be, and both in a review of internal practices and as it relates to some of the private water trusts. We're trying to do a better job of our capital planning, of incorporating other entities' capital plans. So we're trying to reach out to some of the private water trusts to better understand their capital project planning so that we can either adjust or otherwise accommodate our road program accordingly, and probably more importantly, do a good job of communicating to people then why perhaps their road may not be reconstructed at the pace they would otherwise look for. As we move forward, some of our areas of concern, or what we're faced with mostly, is certainly an increased expectation for level of service, whether that's related to EAB abatement or facility repairs, the condition of the fleet that not only affects the Department of Public Works, but we also provide repair services to the fire department, the police department, the water and sewer utilities. We have some concerns about the pool vehicles, which serve a number of city staff members, most notably perhaps the building inspectors. In general, as is a lot of the rest of the market, we're having some concerns about the sustainability of staff and staffing levels. We've had more turnover, whether that's freedom in the market for people to move amongst jobs, or whether that's just a good sign that the economy is growing. We're seeing turnover at records that, or at levels, excuse me, that we just haven't seen in the past. And unfortunately, with a good amount of training and investment in employees for whether it's tree removal operations or snow removal operations, every time we have the turnover, we obviously lose a significant amount of time in otherwise being able to get new staff on board, and then certainly training them for the operations that they otherwise perform. And as I mentioned, with the potential with the GIS service, making sure that we're getting information out to the public, both in a timely manner and in a way that they're otherwise finding the information and digesting it as they may otherwise need. As we move forward, some opportunities that we're considering would be a different way of potentially addressing some of our fleet needs, including whether or not leasing for some of the pool vehicles is an option. We listened to and heard from several of the, both the fire department and the police department about the potential for new facility construction, in addition to some potential momentum as to whether or not there would be a need to rebuild the pool. So those are all opportunities that we'll have moving forward. We'll be looking at the potential of better connection between the park system, including whether or not we would want to put Rotary Pavilion on public water. That would also address some longer term maintenance issues with the facilities there due to poor water quality. Drinkable, to be clear. I just, with respect to maintenance, don't want to go sideways there. Also looking as we continue to address employment concerns with where there may be opportunities to provide for internships or otherwise expand some of our summer employment. We have a great wealth of resources here from the youth in the town, and if we could otherwise continue to get them interested in public works and potentially have them start a career with us, it would be the best of all worlds. And as I mentioned before, continuing to leverage the potential for new GIS capabilities, especially as it relates to interfacing with the public. So of course that leads to what I'm here tonight to ask you for or otherwise discuss. So I have a number of items that we've identified as needs that are outside of what is included in the proposed budget. And that includes the restoration of some operation and maintenance funding to match the expected level of service so that we can continue to, or start to, maybe in some cases, provide what either you or the residents are otherwise looking for us to provide. Making sure that we have salary support to keep good employees. We really do have some very good employees, and it is long-term to the benefit of the organization to be able to keep them here. Again, Emerald Ash Borer abatement, we have several supplemental funding options that I'll go through here that would help us tremendously in terms of addressing the remaining ash trees that need to be removed. Some additional equipment replacement capital funding to address certainly at least some immediate needs that we have in the department, and if not, provide some funding for some of those longer term needs, similar to the facility capital funding. And then the request, as we did last year, for some town center streetscape operation and maintenance funding. Whether or not you came in the front door, you may notice that some of the pavers have begun to sink. Some of the landscape areas are not to what they were originally constructed at. The streetlights need to be, streetlight bases need to be painted. Some of the benches and garbage cans need to be repaired. So looking for some funding that would otherwise allow us to address those issues. More specifically, looking for restoration of some operation and maintenance funding. I'm certainly happy to dive into some of these numbers a little bit more. Salary support, most specifically for our highway and highway parks worker position, which are where we're seeming to see the most frequent turnover in positions. I have some additional detail on the EAB abatement on the next slide. And then otherwise trying to bring the equipment replacement up to 470. To be clear, that's the total request. 280 is what is already included in the budget. Facilities at 250, and then town center streetscape, really if we could have some seed money that continues over time. It's not anything that we want to go through and address just one time, because then 10 years from now, I'll be back here asking you for money again. So the idea would be that if we can have some sustained funding, that we can continue to address the high level of expectation for that streetscape as we move forward. You may recall from the EAB policy discussion that we had earlier this year that we identified a number of opportunities to otherwise help address the EAB abatement issue. Right now we have capital funding that we otherwise use mostly for the tree removal that either our equipment can't address or certainly our personnel can't address safely. That may be trees that are either too large or in a position that we just can't easily get our equipment to. So there's two forms of additional capital funding that could be addressed, that for roadside and that for parks. An increase to our operation and maintenance budget to address personal protective equipment. I indicated in here we've more than tripled the number of chainsaws that we use, and with that, of course, we more than triple the amount of times that we have to sharpen and oil and everything else. In addition to the number of pairs of chaps and safety goggles and other things that we otherwise need for those operations. And then with respect to personnel, we recognize that there is a need to continue to have elevated communication with the public. And so we have a number of different ways that we would welcome help, whether that's with a summer forestry intern, if we could get someone dedicated, especially ideally someone from, maybe a local college program, either horticultural or otherwise, that could help either supplement the tree inventory to address some of the gaps that we have in the system, or certainly help with the communication and logging and tracking of all of the tree requests that are coming through. As you all know, Mike Geese serves as the city forester, but more specifically, he's the Parks and Forestry Superintendent, which means he's being pulled in a lot of different directions. So one of the other options would be for an assistant city forester. We'd certainly look for that to be a working position, so that would be one that would certainly be involved in the tree removal itself, but would also take some of those operations off of Mike's plate as it relates to answering all of the resident phone calls. Mike really averages on a daily basis anywhere between 8 and 36 messages a day, solely related to ash tree removal. And of course, the other thing that would otherwise help would be forestry workers to help more specifically with the tree removal itself. If we could have a 2-person crew dedicated mostly year-round, of course, except in blizzards, to remove trees, then they can certainly help more on a subdivision level to come through and be able to work through not only faster. Obviously, we would continue to supplement tree removal operations with our highway and parks divisions, so that wouldn't otherwise completely eliminate those needs, but it would help a lot in inventory that we otherwise have to address for the remaining ash trees. I just wanted to be able to provide you kind of the math here on our fleet needs. We were otherwise looking at a number of purchases for 2020. We try to replace a plow truck every single year. You may recall earlier this year, we authorized the purchase of 2 new trucks for the sewer utility. It would be great if Public Works could otherwise purchase the old trucks from sewer to renew some of those vehicles that we otherwise have that are beyond their life cycle in the Public Works division. We have a loader lease payment for a previous purchase. And then we'd be looking for any of a combination of those next ones that are listed. Utility work machine, the pavers in the new parking lot are great, but require some specialized snow removal equipment. So we'd be looking at potentially a toolcat that would not only help with the snow removal in the parking lot itself, but would help us get to sidewalks a lot faster, most specifically in the town center area, but also outside of town center. The purchase of a roadside mower, the one that we have, is aging and frequently out for repairs. We were actually otherwise supposed to purchase a street sweeper in 2019, but are looking for that to be moved into 2020. That fulfills not only the need to keep our roads clean and maintained, but it also fulfills a state mandate that we have to otherwise sweep our roads as a part of our stormwater permit. And then, as mentioned, the pool vehicles that are otherwise in need of replacement. The facility capital projects that we did this year, or are doing this year, I guess the last one is still in process, was the rooftop unit replacement. It actually started in 18, but resulted in a deficit going into 2019. First thing of the year, we replaced the boiler here at City Hall. We're still in the process of replacing the doors at the East Side Fire Station. We had to replace the air conditioner in the server room, and then the last three items are associated with the steel lintel repair at the public safety building, most noted right now by the large metal post, otherwise holding up the walkway right now. Looking into next year, we had a number of items that we were otherwise looking to address. The front steps out here at City Hall were actually supposed to be addressed in 2019, but with the reconstruction of the parking lot, we didn't figure having both entrances of City Hall a mess was probably the best face to put forward, so we otherwise pushed that out. We'd be looking for tuck pointing to address a lot of the water leaking issues here at City Hall, and otherwise keep the water outside where it should belong. The replacement of windows and screens that would not only address some of the fogging issues that we have in the windows, but also result in ideally higher energy efficiency. One of the other safety issues at the public safety building is the boiler stack. So we'd be looking to move forward with a replacement of that once we can complete the steel lintel repair. And then again, a number of other items that we were looking to do. The sidewalk in front of the public safety building is not only a tripping hazard, but they have some other maintenance issues that we'd like to address. Dealing with garage doors at Eastside Fire Station. They're large, heavy, and prone to breaking, so we'd like to be able to replace those. Same thing with their entrances at City Hall, to be able to do some stair and rail replacement. A couple of projects in the parks for roof replacement at Reuter Pavilion. The bathhouse roof replacement. And then we'd certainly be looking to resume maybe some funding for a lighting efficiency program. The payback is, well, previously when we had it in place, the payback was less than 18 months. So it would be great if we could otherwise reinvigorate that project to try and result in some energy efficiency projects.
What is the total on the bottom of that page, please? Total of what?
So that's taking the 175 proposed funding, the anticipated deficit that I just went through here, and then adding in all of those projects that were listed.
Thank you.
So with that, we, as DPW staff, look forward to finding more and better ways to increase the level of service. As I mentioned, the turnover of staff at the superintendent level has resulted in a number of great ideas and opportunities to both be more efficient and better stewards to the residents and property owners in the city. And therefore, we're requesting support of adequate operations and maintenance funding to be able to continue that and give us the opportunity to show how good the city's roads, facilities, and parks can be. And with additional opportunities on the horizon for whether that's new facilities or new infrastructure, we want to be sure that we're also addressing the existing needs that we otherwise have. And that is it for me.
Questions? Alderman Boucher.
Thank you for going through that. Just want to make sure I understand differences of what you said based on the memo that we received. So the EAV, I added that up to a total between 380 and 404,000 for all those items, right?
Sure, but well, it would be great if we get all of the items, but we were kind of just outlining all the different ways that the operation could be supported by additional funding. So it wasn't necessarily the expectation that all of those would otherwise be provided.
The reason I ask is in this section, there wasn't any single monetary figure really tossed out as the ask.
Right, that's why I
Yeah.
went through and did that, so that you could have the associated costs.
And then in the equipment replacement capital funding, the goal was 470. Their current budget proposal is 280, meaning the 190,000 deficit. But then again, looking at the slide, it showed a negative 435 at the bottom of the slide.
Yeah, so to be clear, the 470 is a different calculation that our fleet staff did based on maintenance logs and prediction of aging for continued sustained funding. So it didn't look specifically at 2020. I was just trying to show you in that demonstration what we were otherwise looking to purchase in 2020. Obviously, depending on the funding levels, we'll have to make decisions in terms of the pieces of equipment we otherwise would purchase. But we don't assume maybe that we would otherwise be able to accomplish the funding levels that were identified in the fleet study. So we were trying to maybe give a little bit different perspective in terms of what would be helpful and impactful moving forward. Certainly the idea historically was that with sinking funds or capital funds with level funding that in some years we would spend all of it and in other years we wouldn't spend all of it, and that amount would carry over then to address the peaks and valleys. So the 470 was that sustained funding request. What we showed you is the reality of the pieces that we need to otherwise purchase next year and how that compares.
Okay, just trying to make the overall picture of all of the additional item requests out there across all the different groups and making sure, obviously not all of them are going to be funded, but just want to make sure got all of the different details so that we can go through them.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Alderman Meyer.
So, to complete all of the immediate facilities, it was that, am I getting the wrong number, is that 94,000? Or is that,
So that was based on the 175.
So you
Correct,
need
so you're looking
93
for-
more.
to complete all those would be
So
another?
based on those specific projects, and again, I'm trying to otherwise provide the reality between the sustained funding model and then us otherwise going through and actually applying projects. So this was otherwise the project list that we would have had kind of on the 5-year basis in terms of what we were otherwise intending to do.
So this is it's a 5-year, or this is just what you would like to do for 2020 if you had the money to do it?
Right, this is kind of as we look at the more immediate needs, both as a result of the facility assessment study and where we're otherwise spending time and efforts.
I was gonna ask that, is that what is recommended also from our facility study, that these repairs need to be immediately done?
Yeah, our facilities study, we're still working off. In 2019, it had $724,000 of projects done. We got done 1, 2, 3, server room replacement actually wasn't on it. So I think we got, well, with the completion of the steel lintel repair, we'll have gotten 3 of those projects done. So as we look into 2020, where the study's recommendation was $1.9 million, we're both working off of what we didn't complete last year and then what was otherwise identified in the study for this year.
And so the money we put as a little kickstart last year got used for something else?
No, this is what it was otherwise used for. We just only received $175,000.
They wanted 700, the study suggested 725,000. We gave 170. They spent 170. So we're roughly, whatever that comes out to.
So the monies that the additional monies we allotted for last year were actually used for facilities?
Right, so these are the projects that it was otherwise
Okay.
used for. The only thing that's outstanding right now is we've completed the design of the steel lintel repair. That needs
Okay.
to be bid out. And so that's where that 125 is based on the opinion of probable costs that was otherwise provided by the designer. If that is what the bid price ultimately is, we will have to request to deficit spend because we don't have sufficient funding, and that's where that negative 54.5 roughly is.
Okay.
Alderman Strelchak.
So just in summary, to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly, with that list, if you had an additional 94,000 added to the budget as proposed, then you'd be able to cover the items that are on that sheet?
Those projects, yes. So I think the other thing I should note is unfortunately, the majority of the projects that were done in 2019 were need-driven. I mean, the rooftop unit failed. So that's how that project was chosen. The boiler failed. So that's how that project was chosen. The server room AC failed. So that's how that project was chosen. So while
But
we've
they
other.
were all in the facilities assessment report, so it's not.
Right, so this would be, if we were going to be proactive, this is what we would otherwise suggest as our limits. I just want to note that obviously if we have another need that rises more quickly, we would address that first ahead of these projects that are otherwise listed.
And then on EAB, what's the lump sum allocated in the proposed budget this year?
It's
versus-
80,000.
80,000. How much did we spend last year?
For capital. Last year, we were, in 2018, we were funded 40, and I think we spent 38 or something like that. In 2019, we were funded at the 80. By the end of the year, we will have spent all of that allocation.
Didn't we give an additional allocation above the 80? I thought we gave an additional allocation above the 80.
It was the additional allocation above the 40. I requested that the drainage money be moved to EAB, so that was the additional allocation in 19.
So what's Mike's opinion on like keeping up with this? I mean, because when the initial funding was requested, the trees were dying, but they still had green leaves on them.
Right.
Now they're dead.
Right.
And every day and every winter cycle, they're gonna continue to get more brittle. I mean, is 80 gonna cover the safety feature of a storm event where we don't end up with a ton of trees in the roads and in the right-of-ways?
Well, what I can tell you, so 80 is just the contracted services amount. So again, that's the amount that usually either due to our own equipment restrictions, personnel safety, or location of the tree is what we contract out to the professionals, so to speak, although I would argue that many of our crew would now be designated as professionals. I think, change that we would otherwise see in the absence of some supplemental funding options is that the 3,300 trees that we remove a year will change, and we will no longer do shouldering, and we will no longer do drainage work, and we will no longer do other operations because we will have to dedicate all of our staff all of the time to tree removal.
and then you asked, I worked on a tree crew in college, so I'm asking maybe more questions and a little more in depth than I need to. You've got a discussion item as a two-person tree crew. It comes at a pretty high dollar amount because I know there's benefits and there's salary and there's,
Correct. So
liability
that's-
and everything else. Are we better off contracting that out?
No, we get
Have you done the analysis on that?
The majority of the trees are smaller in scale, larger in volume. So we really just need the time and the staff to be able to go through and remove them. There certainly are larger trees in more isolated location or more difficult locations that required contract removal, but really for the most part, we need to deal with the volume of removal, specifically in subdivisions. Maybe some of the newer ones, obviously, there's some older ones that have some large established ash trees, but in the majority of the volume of what we have, they're at a scale that we could otherwise remove with our own efforts.
Okay, and then my last question is regarding the landscaping in the town center areas and the rejuvenating of some of the, settling items and things like that. We're pulling that out of general budget in this discussion. Would it be appropriate to enter into a discussion as to whether or not we should consider allocating those funds through TIF budget?
It's not TIF eligible.
None of it's TIF eligible? New landscaping is, but maintenance is not,
Well-
that's correct?
Kim can obviously speak more specifically. The original installation can be covered by TIF. Replacement or otherwise maintenance cannot be covered by TIF.
That's what I thought, but I just wanted to make sure that we were.
Putting on my Kim hat for a moment.
Alderman Schneider.
Actually, mine was similar to Alderman Strelchek's because on the slide, it had $100,000 listed at the top. I'm back on EAB here, yeah. And then the two-person forestry crew seeming very expensive and also somewhat time-consuming to hire, to train, to get them on board. I was just wondering if it might not be just more efficient to hire outside folks to help us get a little head start on some of these trees that are in need of being taken down because they are now completely dead, as opposed to looking to hire new staff, given that I'm sure, given the climate of tree work, that it might be even hard to recruit our own staff for some of these positions in a timely manner.
To be clear, contracted removal is not necessarily.
Cost effective?
Well, it can be cost effective, but it is time consuming and otherwise a lot of staff time dedicated to that as well. It means we otherwise have to identify for the contracted service all of the trees that are otherwise as a part of the bid, so that takes time, staff, and effort. We obviously have to prepare the actual either request for proposal or bid documents, depending on which version we do, administer that process, go through the packet award process for council to otherwise award it. So it's not necessarily faster, and it's not necessarily more efficient. Now, to be clear, both efforts are needed. I mean, again, the contracted tree removal is wholly different than the tree removal operations that we're doing with existing staff. So both are certainly needed. The potential advantage of the two-person crew is both the efficiency with which we'd be able to work and the communication with the residents, that if we had a dedicated crew that could come into a subdivision and otherwise move through each street and otherwise remove all of the trees in sequential order versus right now, we're really going per the EAB policy through that analysis of a hazard tree, a secondary tree, and a street tree in terms of the removal efforts, because we are certainly restricted in the staff that we otherwise have available to do so. So it would allow for a more efficient operation and, at least from Mike or my perspective, an increased level of service to those that are otherwise looking next door and saying, why did my neighbor's trees get removed and not mine?
Alderman Nerben.
This is one of the smaller items on the list of additional projects, but for the lighting efficiency.
Yeah.
How many not energy efficient fixtures do we have left? And
The majority.
if the payback is really 18 months, it almost pains me that it has to be in a budget because it almost pays for itself within the budget cycle.
We used to have a budget actually specific to that, and at the time, focus on energy grants were also rampant. Unfortunately, they're a little more restrictive now. Energy efficient fixtures are a little more common. So to be clear, the city's former program looked at a number of things. It looked at both changing the actual operation of the lights itself, so having motion censored lights in offices so that people who don't turn their lights off every time they leave after an amount of time that the lights will shut off. So it's not necessarily just the fixture itself, but also looking at the operation in general to reduce energy costs. Obviously, we'd be looking to package a number of things together. Whether or not anyone has noted, we have great energy efficient fixtures in our brand new parking lot. Whether or not then all of the lighting on the exterior of the building bothers anyone because it doesn't match, because it is not energy efficient fixtures. But we'd be, I guess, looking to do those in those types of packages that we'd look at either doing the external lights at City Hall or, the offices over at the East Side Fire Station or whatever, we'd be doing groupings of
I'm
lighting.
sure you get a big enough project till you hit the $10,000 budgeted amount, but I guess my question's a little bit more strategic than that. If you're gonna get your money back in 18 months, why don't we just do some of these things?
The problem for us has been, we haven't had the money. I mean, there has been no facility capital funding in several
Any
years.
reasonable project anytime throughout the year. This is the kind of thing that I think we should be using fund balance for. You make a small investment now and within 18 months it's paid for itself and then you're cash ahead. And you've got a bigger operating budget because you're spending less on electricity. If the payback's really that quick.
That would certainly be the goal.
Alderman Schneider.
This is another smaller line item, but on the pool vehicles, you referenced maybe going to lease because these are old police vehicles which are now at the end of their lifespan potentially. And you probably looked at this, but I'm just wondering, since these are sedans essentially, have you looked at just having the inspector drive their own vehicle and they get reimbursed for mileage?
We have that under our reimbursement. I think there's concerns on several levels though of not having a official city vehicle that they otherwise travel in then. Having a unmarked car come into your driveway and a man come and knock on your door may be concerning to some people. So part of it is about identification and making sure that, we have, or woman, I shouldn't,
Okay.
sorry. I shouldn't
Couldn't
necessarily,
magnets, I'm serious.
say.
Yeah, there are
Car
magnets.
make up for that? Door magnets?
We do have car magnets. I mean, we've used them for other things in the past. I'm not sure we've done an exercise to determine it would be any cheaper to do it that way than otherwise. I mean, we provide the fuel for the pool vehicles, obviously at a discounted rate. We provide all of our own maintenance in-house. Well, I guess we wouldn't be maintaining anyone's personal vehicle, so. But that, I guess, to your point, is wherever it was, one of the opportunities to otherwise look at different ways of structuring it. We've both been contacted by Enterprise with a program that they have for car replacement, and we've reached out to some expertise on the council that may otherwise be able to help us explore some of that as well.
You're doing that, Alderman Schneider? Oh, never mind. The one thing that's not in your memo, and I guess despite your kind of, I'm sure you were looking for more things to add to it, but one cost that we've talked about, but doesn't come up here at all, that may actually over time pay for itself also, is the concept of automating the brush site. And unless I missed that.
So it was in our, when we make capital requests, we make 5-year requests. So it was in the 5-year request. It wasn't a request for 2020. Personally, for the department, it's not necessarily as high of an impact. So that's part of the reason that it wasn't necessarily structured as one of my highest prioritized items. But if it is otherwise a high priority item, the first steps would be to otherwise better determine what needs to be done in order to do it. We know generally the requirements to be able to bring internet to the site in some form. In addition to the infrastructure itself for the automated gate, there's typically a camera system both to be able to record the actual people that are coming in and out, in addition to any security concerns. The system for whether it's a card or a fob or whatever it is, getting more into that. So if that was a part of, more of a strategic planning effort that we wanted to look into, we could spend 2020 certainly drilling down into what those costs and impacts will be. Selfishly, the other thing that I'd want to look at the same time is the reconstruction of the lot, if you can call it that any more. That's been an issue for a long time because the brush season is generally open the exact same time that asphalt plants are. So it's very difficult for us to really do anything in that lot outside of the brush site. So if there's an opportunity to incorporate that reconstruction as a part of the installation of an automated gate, we'd certainly be looking for that opportunity.
Well, I think we should at least look at that during the coming year, but, this is not a time for it. That was a question. Alderman Boucher.
First, thank you for bringing that up about the automated brush. It's a good point that somebody else mentioned to me in the past, looking for. Just to follow up on the EAB, if we continue at the 80,000 level, do you have a guess? Are we looking at 3 to 4 years, 6, 7 years, 10 years? How long before this gets finally squelched?
Unfortunately, at existing efforts, we're probably at 10 years, but we don't have 10 years.
Well, what does that mean?
Yeah. Because of the accelerated
They'll all fall down.
deterioration of the trees, we don't have 10 years to otherwise address the majority of them. So as I mentioned, depending on other efforts and services, we would increase then the amount of time that our other crews are spent removing trees to otherwise address the removal rates that ideally match the deterioration.
I've got one in my front yard that's dropping limbs in the cities on the road already, and I'm on the east side where we're supposed to hit last. For now, I'm cutting them up and taking care of them, but pretty soon the whole tree's gonna go.
Other questions?
I got rid of 3 this year.
Well, thank you. This was useful.
Good evening.
Hello.
Hello. All right, so I'll give you an overview of community development. I think you guys know a lot of the information that's on these initial slides, but the functions within community development are really broken down by 2 divisions, both planning and inspections divisions, but we do much more than that. We staff a number of boards and commissions. We focus on economic development. We have a GIS coordinator. We have a health inspector and an enforcement officer. Community development has 3 urban planners, 5 certified inspectors. We have a part-time enforcement officer. That position is contracted. We also contract for construction plan review. This is really to provide additional level of service. So if there is someone in need of an expedited plan review, we offer this service, which can be a 24-hour turnaround. It's completely a pass-through cost to the applicant. We also contract for landscape plan review, similar situation. We have a consultant that does the plan review, and that's completely a pass-through cost. And then we have 2.5 administrative staff members. This is the snapshot of the last 5 years of our funding. You can see that we've had an increase in our total budget over the last 5 years. Our operating budget for 2020 will increase slightly again. Most of our budget, 93%, is fixed costs, and 90% is offset by the revenue that the department generates. That revenue that offset of revenue is probably higher if you were to take out those pass-through contracted services, where it's shown as an expenditure in our budget, but we don't recuperate the dollars of reimbursement by the applicant or the developer that pays for that. In terms of our 5-year trend, we manage over 3,800 construction permits annually. We manage over 150 development approvals on an annual basis. This is a really conservative number, but we manage over 500 public contacts per week. And we, on an average, have generated over $900,000 in annual revenue for the city. Our current and continued efforts is putting us in a position that all of our TIDs will cash flow positive at their closure. The Town Center TID has had a growth value of $117 million. That's over a 1,700% increase. We recently went through that TIF 3, Town Center TIF amendment, so I'm sure you're recalling some of the data that was presented as part of that. That TIF district will close on time, even if there is no other development that occurs in the TIF district. We focus a lot of our time on the public-private partnerships within the town center, and we have also seen substantial new development occurring on Port Washington Road through a number of redevelopment projects. We've also continued to see efforts towards new residential development, not only central growth, but some infill and a handful of rural subdivision projects that have been going on over the last couple of years. There's been quite a bit of legwork and staff put towards an outreach program to try to build relationships with, in particular, our industrial business owners. And currently we're working on a workforce transportation program that could maybe assist our business owners. It was the one consistent and largest concern we heard from those business owners after meeting with them. We do achieve our life safety inspections compliance, and we also completed a development moratorium in the last 12 to 18 months. I would suggest to the council, as I have before, that when we have the opportunity to be proactive in our planning efforts, we have proven a pretty high success rate. The examples of that include central growth, include town center, include development of new code language, streamlining the process through our development agreement process, and I think you'll continue to see that throughout this year in 2020 as the Planning Commission Policy Subcommittee works particularly on the Port Washington Road corridor and what we've referred to as East Growth. I mentioned business outreach. I think that will continue to go beyond just the relationship building that we've done with that industrial business ownership sector. We also have, I feel, like 2 community development surveys to respond to yet. I think there's some initiatives from the previous survey that focused on development that could result in some program opportunities for the department and for the city. We've focused on Gateway, and I think through Town Center, we'll continue to focus on beautification of that particular neighborhood. Of course, handling text amendments. One thing I mentioned as an initiative that I think we need to consider as we move forward is those community relationships, being proactive in terms of promoting the city. When there happens to be negative comment or information out in our community, an opportunity to respond to that positively, I think, is important. And to have a consistent message or story coming out of the city organization, I think, is critical to our customer base. We continue to strive for efficiency gains through process and technology. Our opportunities going forward are town center improvements. As you may recall from the project plan amendment, we have a little over $2 million of cash financing that we could do in order to make some of the additional expenditures that we wanted in the TIF district. And we'll come back later this year to have that conversation with the council to see what, if any, priorities there is. If you wanted to debt borrow, there's capacity up to 15 million. No one's expecting that, but that it does show some of the success of the TIF district in that particular case. As Kristen mentioned, town center maintenance, I think, is critical. I support and would concur with her on the need for some maintenance, particularly in our department and regularly at the planning commission, right? We're always advocating, pushing developers, property owners to invest with high quality design and high quality finishes to their site. I would like to be able to say that the city does the same with all of our investments as well. I touched a little bit just a few minutes ago about that coordinated public promotion and communications. I know administration had spoke to that in their memo as well as in their presentation last week. And again, I'm touching on technology. There are issues with both centralized data. That's an organization-wide issue. That inability to have centralized data has caused our department a delay in implementing the Munis module that is available to our department. Essentially, garbage of data in is going to result in garbage of data coming out. We have an antiquated technology system or software program on the inspection side, inspections division. It's called Black Bear. It cannot be repaired. It cannot be updated. We cannot run reports through it. So whether it's information or reporting on permits. So for example, you get a monthly report about the number of permits and what types of permits are coming in, and then an annual total at the end of the year. That's all being done manually at this point. We also lack project management software program. As I mentioned in our memo, we simply have a hard copy of all of our files as well as an electronic system in which we scan information. There is, I think, a desire and a need in other communities that show project management programs that allow the public, particularly applicants and developers, to have insight and a snapshot of certain information within that program, so they can be themselves tracking where their project is and what the status is and what the sign-off within the city, of their department or of their project is at any given time. There's local examples throughout the state that we could borrow. It may not need to be as robust as something like the city of Madison uses, but there's plenty of opportunities that we could explore going forward on how that might improve communications with our developers and applicants, as well as create efficiencies. So that is really my snapshot. I'm not, I think when you listen to some of the other departments' needs, particularly Public Works that you just heard from, and when you look at that 5-year trend for my department, we're thankful for some additional staff resources that we've received over the last couple of years. There's been, other than me, turnover in the department over the last decade. I mean, it's not all happening in 1 year, but 90% of the department has turned over. And just in the last 18 months, we were able to provide 3 additional employees to the department. I think that's helping us keep up with the pace of development. My biggest, I think, opportunity in which you could see some efficiency gained is that technology initiative. I think there's organization-wide benefits to that, but particularly efficiencies for the department.
And I don't know whether this is more properly addressed to you or to Director Lundin, but you both mentioned maintenance in the town center, but maybe I missed it, but I didn't see a number associated with that.
Director Lundin suggested some seed money of $5,000 to $10,000 in order to allow us to do some maintenance in 2020 and continuing, I think, funding that program.
Thank you.
Support that.
Other questions? Alderman Meyer.
You're talking about the software programs that are outdated and we need, is our whole operating system capable of additional programs to that? And I guess it's being addressed to, maybe you will, all right, you know, that.
Yeah.
So if we did say, okay, the software program for that is, I don't know, the number is 25 grand, whatever it is to do it, is our total system here capable of incorporating that new program into it? And I see the head shake yes in the back.
Yeah, initially, I think with the implementation of Munis, one of the goals or objectives for the city was to make sure we didn't have these silo programs, right? So Munis provides the opportunity for the department's information to speak with one another. I mean, it's critical in terms of permit information that we're entering and the fees exchanged with finance for that. So we're using some components of Munis. The assessor's office uses a different type of program for a lot of information that we utilize, like assessed and land value, building improvement value, total assessment, the type of structure, how it's classified, how the land's classified. It doesn't necessarily allow us to coordinate that with our GIS program. So there.
is that a one particular program for that, or is that multiple programs to incorporate that?
If we could establish a centralized database, we can leverage the additional Munis models that we need from a building permit and a planning application or a development application and approval process. The limitation of that will be that we wouldn't likely have the ability for the public or the applicant to view certain information or components of their project through the process. The additional challenge, I think, with the Munis implementation, and part of the reason why we've resisted it in our department until we get that centralized data, is it also is going to require probably 40% of at least one key member's weekly hours. So staff dedication at about 40% of their typical weekly hours for about 5 months. With the pace of development and even with our increase in staffing resources, that's a little bit tough for us to think about, taking on. That's necessary, right, of any new program, but that's gonna be a little bit more labor intense. And I think before we can even go down the path of discussing how all of that can be structured, we've gotta get a handle around the centralized data. And what I mean by that is, some programs are entering North Port Washington Road with an N and Port Wash instead of and then others are doing North Port Washington Road. So all of that has to get cleaned up.
So that's a personnel issue then to do that?
Yes, even moving away from Black Bear will require someone with either in the department or the organization to manually manage that input. And then the centralized data, while it's really not just a community development need, it's a department or an organization need across all departments. The development staff probably best understand how to organize that data in a way that all of the departments would be able to best utilize it.
Alderman Nervin.
The issue with the data, my company went through something similar, transitioning from ERP systems. We literally created some basic guidelines and we hired temps to do much of it. So you might be able to just contract that out at a really, really low rate as well.
And
I see Len shaking his head
yeah,
up and down.
I think that is one of the solutions. There will still need to be oversight to make sure that is handled and entered.
There's always corner cases that you can't write good instructions for,
Yeah.
But to echo
That's it.
Director Tollefson's earlier comments, I think over the last couple of years, we've just kind of been chasing the level and the scale of development that's occurring from a permit standpoint, that we've just been trying to keep up with everyone coming in the door. But thanks to the council and your foresight, based on some of the data that's been put up on the slides here tonight, I think we're now appropriately positioned from a staffing standpoint. We don't need to add any further staff, but we're probably gonna realize or require some additional contracted resources to help move this project into the end zone. So the time is right, but I think a key consideration is how this fits into an overall review of the department and the permitting process and the land development process. Should we go through that exercise first, before we devote a lot of resources to the technology side? It may make sense to have an independent third party come in and give us their view of the world, and then build off of those recommendations and look at next year for maybe some additional funding recommendations.
And if I can add to that, I was, a few months ago really of the mindset that I wanted to come in with some more specific technology solutions, but with the idea of perhaps a more global overview of the department, and particularly that public promotion or communication effort that I think is needed, those two things, that and technology, if that's part of what is included as part of the overview of the department, then I think in 2020, we're in a better position to come back to you with specific strides for improvement in those, and what perhaps the cost options or alternative cost options would be.
And for people's information, I've talked to a couple of vendors who, of course, we haven't given them a scope of services, so the idea, in each case I needed to explain a little bit about what the size of our staff was, a little bit about our community, and what an overview might look like. But these are companies that have done that for a lot of communities. One here in Wisconsin, one in California, although they do stuff here in the Midwest, and another one, I think in Ohio. The range I'm getting, it was all kind of consistent, but they of course all hedge, hey, we don't know really what you're asking until we have more information about what your scope and what you'd like done. But they're saying somewhere between $40,000 and $70,000 to do an overview of community development, permitting, and also the interrelationship between community development and engineering. And that, plus the technology, the what we do as far as development itself. Not that they're happy to make recommendations on policies, but if we wanted to go to them, how do we develop more? But that, I made it clear that wasn't what we were looking for. It's not like we're looking to change our standards or how, what we approve, what we don't approve, but simply looking at systems and personnel and technology and interrelationship and how all that stuff happens with some outreach to the development community as well as builders and the public. So
And looking at best practices.
yeah, Alderman.
Mr. Alchek?
Rob.
I think having a disconnect in technology it's an insurmountable challenge for a community. And I think when people come to community development, they're looking for two things. One is accuracy of service, and then number two is efficiency of service. And I think if you've got inconsistencies in your data, communicating with different departments, communicating within your own department, that impacts the two key elements that people are looking for when they deal with your department. Now, where we're saying it's probably not a budget item for this current budget, although it could be added in, we don't know. I would recommend strongly that this comes forward to some committee, some subcommittee, even a committee of the whole, and we kind of talk about how things work and see if we can address that long prior to next year's budget, so we have an understanding of what your needs are, and we can do a better job as a city, so. It's great.
Other questions? thank you to both of you. Jobs well done. We have a lot to think about for October 3, and it will be a complicated mess to take the binder and all this information and try to figure out what we want to do and prioritize, but that's our next step, correct? Any other comments, Bill?
Just to reiterate, one of the earlier points at the beginning of the meeting, my office and the finance department will not only be getting the slide decks out to each of you, should you want to use those as resources, those will go out tomorrow. We'll be putting out a short correspondence, a couple of pages, summarizing all of the requests that have been covered here over the last 2 evenings, so that you have a worksheet to bring with you to appropriations. And we'll include any other information or recommendations that are pertinent to next week's discussion in that document. And that'll go out either late this week or early next week at the latest.
One other suggestion, if people believe that they have a budgetary concept, that something that ought to be included in the budget that hasn't been addressed, you think we ought to, I don't know what the heck it is, but please let Will know that sooner rather than later, so there can be, the appropriate department head can look at it, can comment on it, can talk about cost, so that we're not shooting in the dark when we come to the actual appropriations meeting based on some concept. I mean, part of us doing this early was so that we weren't entirely reactive at the last possible minute, that people, if they're both staff, but the council also, to the extent there's something, of course, we'll probably shoot it down, but you ought to be able to talk about it. So try to do that sooner rather than later. Anything else from anybody? Oh, Alderman Boucher.
Just a quick follow-up, actually. The mayor had asked us a number of times at the last session, and when you put this out, would it be possible to include, when you itemize the different asks, that like if there's something that's considered urgent or like the highest priority? I know that you don't want to, everyone knows if you order it from 1 to 5, then okay, the ones go away, but if there's items that are like, these are really our most urgent needs, to somehow highlight those.
By department or by the whole list?
I would say it would be by department because of the individuals bringing them forward, and then, but at least that would give us kind of a scale, like where we start drawing some lines.
I think that'd be helpful.
So a prioritized list categorized by department.
Prioritized by the department and
Yeah.
categorized by the department, yes.
Got it.
I don't think you need any more than what, the top 5?
Right. Probably the top 5.
I'll put all, you only need to
Top
list the
five
top.
or rank them
No,
all.
number.
I mean, like
rank top
30
5.
we'd never get to.
If you
but
put the
if
rest
we
of
do-
them that you have here on the list, because it's still good to have the overall wish list. It may be of some benefit. It may be that somebody here who has a preference for something that's number 7.
Okay.
And
We can do that.
anything else? A motion would be in order.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.